Okay, well, good morning, everybody. We have upwards of 80 participants online, and really thrilled to see that. My name's Alistair Kent, and I'm coordinating the various activities of the Tailings Working Group, which is part of the Environmental and Social Responsibility Society of CIM. The topic today clearly ignites your interest, and we're very pleased to have gathered the expertise and experience that you'll hear from today. I'd like to point out that you'll also probably be interested in a workshop being held at the upcoming CIM conference on May 1st in sunny Vancouver. It's called Integrated Tailings Management, focusing on safety and effective standard compliance. And we've got presenters, a really top-notch group of accountable executives and consultants from Agnico Eagle, BHP, Rio Tinto, Vale, Teck, senior representative from the Mining Association of Canada, and consultants from SRK, and our very own Karen Chauvin, who's chair of our society. The workshop, of course, deals with challenges of the different guidances and standards out there, such as MAX, TSN, and the newly minted GISTM, especially in the wake of recent failures. We welcome your registration to this event using the CIM website. You don't have to register for the entire conference. We're also trying to give you an online option in case you're still COVID wary. I'd like to introduce my co-conspirator in the working group, Karen Chauvin. She's currently chair of the ESRS and a tireless contributor to the Tailings Working Group. She's also going to be a presenter in the upcoming workshop. Also, Dave Wilms of Clone Crippen Berger, participant in our working group, who will assist in managing the Q&A of this webinar. And I had the recent experience of working with Dave and Clone Crippen Berger team on a challenging decision analysis project. When we came up with the idea for this webinar in our working group meetings, the folks at Clone Crippen volunteered, but they also insisted that they collaborate with others in industry and consulting to ensure a balanced and non-promotional flavor. Kudos to them for that approach. It's the CIM approach and attitude. Let me introduce our speakers now then. First of all, we have Mr. Darryl Hockley. He's a professional engineer with 35 years experience. He leads closure, tailings, and water management projects for clients around the mining world, and he's been facilitating the associated decision processes for over 25 years. He's a corporate consultant in SRK Canada's Vancouver office. Also, very pleased to welcome Cassandra Hall. She's a professional engineer and a professional geoscientist with 20 years experience in tailings dam investigation, design and operations. She is currently manager, tailings, water and crush leach in the technical services group at Freeport-McMoRan. Cassandra is responsible for tailings and water stewardship programs, as well as supporting the independent tailings review board process. And we have Andy Small, who's a professional engineer in geotechnical that has specialized in dam safety and dam design for over 30 years. Andy works for Clone Crippen Berger and provides dam safety and dam design services to the mining industry. He lives in Eastern Canada and has worked across Canada and internationally. He's an active member of the Canadian Dam Association and International Commission on Large Dams. He has been conducting decision analysis and providing training for decision analysis for over 20 years. So there you have it. Please do enjoy the seminar. Post your questions to the question board, and we'll do our best to clear them at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Now, am I supposed to hit something here for you to take it?
I'll try to on my screen. Please let me know if you're. Are you seeing a presentation, or are you seeing presenter view right now?
Seeing the presentation now.
We see the sneak peek where you see the next slide. So I think if you can go to display settings and just drop down, it should just show the one slide.
How about that? Is that better?
Perfect.
Yes, thank you.
A slightly different set of buttons here. Good. Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Thanks for the introductions. As promised, we're going to talk today about lessons learned from tailings decision analysis. This won't be a short course on how to do decision analysis. That would take a bit longer than we have available. It may seem like a short course at times because we will introduce a few things, a kind of structure to the thinking. But think of the structure as a scaffolding for us to present the lessons that we've learned over the years in practical applications. For those of you who don't have any experience with decision analysis, there should be enough of a structure to give you a bit of an introduction. But we saw on the attendee list a lot of people who have as much experience or more than all of us do. So we look forward to the last session discussion where we can hear from lessons learned from other people. I'm going to start talking about the selection of a decision analysis method. The graphic on the right here. Sorry, can you see my arrow when I'm moving? Not.
I don't see it. Can you show it again? Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, sorry, just let me rearrange a couple of things here. Yeah. So the figure on the right here shows an overarching structure for decision analysis, and we're putting it here because most people think of decision analysis as being really this section down here, the pink and the orange. But it's very important that you get started with a few first steps. And Andy will talk more about formulating a clear decision statement. So I'm going to emphasize the issue of who's involved in the decision. There's a lot of people involved in decision analysis, and only some of them are actually going to make the decision. And it's quite possible, in my experience at least, that some of the true decision makers aren't even in the meeting where the decision is analyzed. So the analysis becomes an input to a decision by others. It's quite important to understand that at the start. Obviously, if you're running the workshop, you need to know that. But even if you're participating, it's unfair to participants to let them think they're actually making the decision when what they're really doing is informing the decision. So identifying who's a stakeholder, who's a participant, who's a rights holder, who's a decision maker, all those sorts of things are quite important in getting started on the process. What options are being considered? Clearly, that's an important question. What level do those options need to be defined? Do you need to have class 4 cost estimates for every option? Do you need to have PowerPoint slides with a order of magnitude estimate? That's quite important, obviously, to get started on to take the right things to the options identification. What we've commonly seen is one option comes in very well worked out and the others come in very poorly worked out, and that significantly biases the process for positive or negative. Sometimes the more you know about an option, the less you like it. Sometimes the less you know about it, the more you like it. So you can bias the decision both ways if you don't come in with your options consistently defined. All of these questions boil down to the last one here. What are the required levels in your analysis for defining the options, for making the preferences as transparent as possible? Do you want everyone to explicitly state their weightings and agree on their ratings, or is there another way to do that? And finally, who are you going to have to defend this decision to? And by that I mean, in a company context, most decisions ultimately end up before some sort of a capital budgeting system. Maybe it's a stage gating process or an internal peer review, something like that. They're the ones who ultimately are going to need to sign off that this decision analysis and the resulting decision is adequately based. So they're the ones who are going to need a certain amount of transparency, a significant amount of transparency. It's not enough, in other words, to get the right decision. It's important. It's essential to do it in a way that's transparent to the later reviewers. Only after you've thought through all of those things are you actually ready to choose an appropriate decision analysis method. I prefer to think that this is a first lesson learned, I guess, from me, that it really helps to think of decision analysis as a form of modeling. In the same way as we can take a very complex physical system like groundwater flow, and simplify it to produce a conceptual model or a numerical model, we can take very complex decisions and simplify those into the form of models. Just like in physical modeling, you need to make assumptions in decision modeling. And hopefully you choose assumptions that are appropriate for your particular modeling objectives. Just like with physical models, the resulting numbers aren't usually the complete answer. Even a range of numbers coming from a lot of sensitivity analysis is not necessarily the answer, but they will help you to understand the decision. So I found over the years that forcing ourselves to put everything we know about a physical system or a decision in the form of a rigorous model can be a catalyst for clarity. And that's a term that I'm borrowing from Andy. You'll hear it later in his presentation too. And I'll come back to this analogy between decision modeling and physical modeling, because I think most of the people on the line are very familiar with physical modeling, and they may not think of decision analysis as being another form of modeling. And as I said, it's been very helpful to me to think in those terms over the years. All right. So Google search for decision analysis methods returned 6.2 billion results, which sounds like an impressive number, but these days a Google search for just about anything returned 6.2 billion results. The first three, the first article, at least, pardon me, talked about 16 different decision-making techniques. And the next one talks about 7 types of decision analysis. So you're getting a flavor already for the number of methods that might be out there. Interestingly, the next 4 articles only talk about one method each, different methods, but one method each. And they each talk about that method as if it was the only method. And that's another common problem in decision analysis. You'll often see a single method presented as the only method. I think we have an example of that in Canada and in the tailings community, where one particular method called multi-attribute analysis is often seen as the method. I don't want to knock MAA at all. It played a very significant role in our industry. It was the first method, a paper by Andy Robertson and Shannon Shaw in the 1990s. So it's the first method to see widespread use, and many of us learned the value of rigorous decision analysis using MAA. But like all such methods, it has limitations. And if we continue to treat it as the only method, opponents are going to discover those limitations and use them to discredit not just the current decision, but conceivably a lot of previous ones as well. So the broader term multi-criteria decision analysis refers to is a more general statement of a more general name for the term for the category in which MAA falls. So back to the analogy between decision models and physical models. Decision analysis is a very large field. If a list of decision analysis methods is likely to be just as comprehensive as, for example, a list of geotechnical engineering methods. Multi-criteria decision analysis is a set of methods similar to, for example, slope stability analysis. But geotechnical engineers know there are many methods to analyze slope stability. Each has its own weaknesses, and they need to know how to choose the right method for each problem. It's the same principle with choosing an MCDA method. MAA is one of the softwares, if you like, available to do MCDA. Telling somebody that they need to do an MAA is a lot like telling a geotechnical engineer you need to do a slope W. It might be correct in some cases, but it's overly specific, and it takes away the need for judgment as to what's really the appropriate method and the appropriate software. Okay, this is from the list of 16 different decision-making techniques, the first thing returned by Google. 6 of them aren't really methods at all, but the others are, and I've grouped them in a way that helps us to sort of see the general pattern in these methods. Trial and error is a particularly good decision-making method, but not necessarily for things like tailings siting studies, obviously. The next level of complexity, listing pros and cons or doing pairwise comparisons, seems simple, but is surprisingly powerful. I use it quite a bit in options analysis for tailings. I use it for pairwise comparisons in particular to reduce the number of variants that we want to try to get down to 3 or 4 major classes, and I want the best representative of each class of options. And I can do that commonly. We can do that quite commonly using this as a very simple pairwise comparison method. These blue methods here, or these methods highlighted in blue, are generally quantitative methods, and they you almost certainly will have heard about them at some point in your past education or career. The feature about most of these, in particular the first 3, not necessarily the 4th one, but the first 3, is you have to be able to reduce your decision to a common unit of value, typically dollars and cents. If you have values that are not reducible to dollars and cents, or not universally agreed to be reversible to dollars and cents, then you're in this domain where you need to talk about multi-criteria decision analysis. If all the criteria in a multi-criteria can be reduced to dollars, these simple methods are generally adequate. It's only when they can't be reduced to dollars or universally agreed to be reduced to the same dollars that you need to look into these other methods, and this is what we'll be focusing most on today. Hierarchy is a common variant of MCDA, or in some people would say it's a supporting method to MCDA. Now, the last purple one here is another lesson learned. I didn't realize this for about 15 years of doing this work, but all of these methods rely on goodwill. I guess I did realize that, but I didn't realize it even very fundamentally. They assume goodwill amongst all participants. They assume everybody is genuinely trying to evaluate the options fairly and trying to help each other arrive at a decision. If you're into a situation where you have, say, 2 partners in a negotiation and they don't agree about the option and they're trying to bias the judgments, these methods don't work. Even with very strong facilitation, the methods are fundamentally flawed in that case. And you need to be thinking about negotiation methods or game theory methods rather than simple decision analysis methods. Okay, this is a simple 2-axis chart that I find has been helpful for helping choose the right level of decision making in mining projects in general, but particularly in tailings projects. So we want the simplest possible method. And the 2 axes here are on this, sorry, I got to point to the right screen. On this axis, we have project complexity. And what I mean by that is if a project is simple or if a decision is simple, everything can be reduced to a single unit of value, like cost. If not, if it's a much more complex decision than that, then you'd be further along on this axis. The bottom axis is stakeholder complexity. And this end of it would be a single group of people, say the environmental team in a certain in a mining company. If it's the environmental team, the mining team, and the corporate investment people, that's moving a little further along the line of stakeholder complexity. If it's multiple stakeholders or rights holders in the community and neighboring areas, that's getting to the extreme end of the stakeholder complexity. So that's this scale here. And we can use these scales to break into roughly 4 domains. The first thing I want you to notice is that MCDA shows up in one form or another in 3 of these 4 domains. It seems to have become a default choice for tailings decisions, and in part that's because it can be scaled up or scaled down to deal with different levels of complexity. It's only the wrong choice when a much simpler method can be chosen, and that's domain 1. Okay. And as mentioned before, even for very complex decisions, some of these methods can be very helpful. So back to the modeling analogy, you wouldn't want to be a geotechnical engineer who advises a client to do a full 3D deformation analysis when something like a 2D factor of safety calculation would be adequate. So we'd like to see people being just as reluctant to recommend MCDA or MAA when simpler decision analysis models are adequate. Okay. Yeah, to try to take those abstract domains and make them a little more concrete, I've got a very simple example here. I won't go through the whole chart. The whole table is here for you to look at later. So please, maybe let's just follow me, and I'll focus on just 3 of these. So the example is a site selection, and we're choosing between 2 brownfield sites for something like a 3,000 ton a day dry stack. This is the chart from the previous thing here with the 4 domains: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Oh, sorry, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So first, I'd like to focus on this one here. You see, this is the first row where we go from simple methods to MCDA of some form. And the example here is that one of these sites is nearer to the mine camp, and there's a potential for visual and noise impacts on the people living in the camp who would be staff. So visual and noise impacts are aesthetic concerns that are very difficult to convert to dollars in general. So they're incommensurable with other evaluation factors. Incommensurable is an important word, sorry to, but mensurable means measurable. Commensurable means measurable together. Incommensurable means you can't measure them by the same scale. There's no scale that you could use to measure these different things. So aesthetic concerns generally are incommensurable with say dollars. And that's the reason why you need to go to an MCDA at this level of decision. I think the next one we want to talk about is this row here. And here it goes from MCDA, internal MCDA or simple MCDA to multi-stakeholder MCDA. And the example here is that one of these dry stack locations is now near a residential neighborhood, and there's visual dust and noise impacts on parties who are not staff. So it's difficult for staff to fully understand the community concerns. There's certainly going to be people on staff who will know something about community concerns, but in general, you'd want to have some form of community representation involved in a decision like this, if you can. And that gets you from simple MCDA to multi-stakeholder MCDA. The last row I want to point out is this one, something called non-quantitative MCDA. Is really a method that we've developed for working with First Nations. We've used it about 15 times now in one form or another, with many of you on the call have been part of those. And this is a case where you involve a traditional rights holder or a traditional stakeholder. The fully quantitative MCDA in general is a very quantitative method. You throw around a lot of numbers, and I've always found that disadvantages certain stakeholders. And if you can re-express the decisions or the evaluation factors in non-quantitative terms, you really enrich the discussion. You get them much more involved in the discussion. So that's a non-quantitative MCDA is one of the ones in this far quadrant here. So please take your time later to look at the rest of this. Also, the next slide here has more detail on the strengths and weaknesses of each of these methods, and it has a few references down the bottom, and we're not going to go through those now, but they're for your later review. So now I'll just make a bit of a segue into the next discussion. I started off using this chart, which is a picture of, sorry, I started out using this chart, which is a picture of overall decision analysis. Andy and Cassandra are going to talk about MCDA only. So they'll use a slightly different vocabulary. They'll use the vocabulary that's on the left here. This is a crosstalk, just so you can later convince yourselves that we were actually talking about the same thing, using slightly different vocabulary. Again, don't spend a lot of time on it now. It should help you later, though, if you're going through these slides and trying to see the linkage between the two areas. And my last slide, I think, to recapping the lessons that I've learned over the years. Again, very happy to hear later. People have heard different lessons, totally contrary lessons, and is also very interested in hearing that. But what I've learned over the years, it's really helpful to think of the decision analysis as a form of modeling. I know a lot about modeling. It didn't occur to me for the first 10 years that that's what I was doing in decision analysis. When that light bulb finally turned on, it made everything a lot clearer. MCDA is only one of the methods, but all these methods have their own strengths and weaknesses. And MAA, the most common one in Canada, tailings, siting, et cetera, it's just a particular software for one of many softwares for implementing MCDA, and again with its particular weaknesses. So users of MCDA should understand the other options. And of course, all of us need to be aware of the weaknesses of any model we use in decision analysis, just as in any other field. And with that, I'll pass over to Andy.
Thank you, Daryl. While Karen is flipping around the sharing privileges, show my screen. Okay, so which screen got shared? My emails or the presentation?
Email at the moment.
Thank you. It's funny, Teams, they reverse the screen numbers. WebEx reverses them again. GoToMeeting reverses them again. Now are we sharing the correct screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so well done, Daryl. So it's been a pleasure working with Daryl on this initiative here, and I guess it's flipping the screens on me again, isn't it? Okay, there we go. And we've been able to compare notes on several calls with Daryl and Cassandra and Dave and Kate, and it's been very, very enjoyable working with Daryl and getting this put together. So our presentation is going to talk about the decision analysis approach, which Daryl spent a lot of time talking about. Daryl's introduced the steps. We're just going to do a quick recap of them again. We're going to talk about a tailing site selection project, but I think it's well recognized that this approach can be used for anything where you're confronted with a decision. And yes, Daryl's point about complexity and keeping it simple is quite important, but you can use it for closure planning or dam modifications or other things related to a mining operation. But my wife and I actually used it when we were trying to figure out what we want to do for buying a house or going on vacation. So it wasn't very complicated, and it was very important to pay attention to your key stakeholders in those discussions. But the concepts we're going to be describing for you here are actually fundamental in probably any decision making you're trying to make. Now, this MCDA is based on an approach by Kepner-Trigo, and you can go to their website and see how they do this. And you can actually hire Kepner-Trigo facilitators to come in and do this type of work for you. It's fundamentally structured common sense. There's nothing really magical about this. But one of the things that really comes out of this is a balanced decision. And I find its true strength is getting and keeping everyone on the same wavelength, on the same page of the playbook. So no matter what decision analysis method or model you choose, if you're not on the same page, the decision will probably fail. This tool allows you to get people on the same page from very disparate backgrounds. Daryl had identified these different steps. This is just a recap. Daryl emphasized how important it was to identify the stakeholders, and Daryl indicated that you need to understand up front what you're doing in terms of providing input or informing, or whether your stakeholders are actually capable of making the decision you're trying to make. The decision statement, we're going to talk a bit about that, is a critical step. Objectives, this is where we get into musts and wants. You're going to see how we do not consider cost under the heading of objectives. Costs are split out, and you'll see the alternatives are really discussed here. And many decision analyses or decision processes you may be involved with, you typically start off with I have 5 alternatives, need to make the best decision between the 5 alternatives. And fundamentally that skips 3 or 4 steps. And so by forcing people to think through these steps first before getting to here, suddenly these alternatives either become clearer or some of them fall off the radar pretty quickly. There's a scoring, but you're going to see how I'm not that hung up on the scoring. A risk assessment, on the alternatives that helps to better understand whether the alternatives you've developed have been thought through sufficiently. And with all that, a decision can be made in a course of action. Now, the decision may be, I have selected site X for my tailings, or I have selected closure plan Y for my mine site. But the decision that you're trying to make may not be that. It may be, I have narrowed down the sites to 3 or 4 candidate sites, and now at least I understand the course of action I need to take to further narrow that down. And as I said earlier, this approach is very suitable for a variety of important decisions, no matter what their scale.
Just,
So when we're
just for Andy,
yes, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah,
this is
go ahead.
just going to note, you know, Freeport uses the decision analysis tool, and you know, my comments as Andy is going through the slides, you know, represent a non-regulatory process and perspective for our own decision-making purposes. Just wanted to add that
Yeah,
in.
thank you, Cassandra. So when we're looking at the stakeholders, we want to look at those people that are affected by the decision, could have input to the decision, have to approve it, or could block it. And we often find this is the problem. In spite of your best efforts, somebody's going to sit in the bushes with a mortar and fire mortar shells at what you've tried to do. So it's very important that you identify those particular blockers and actually find ways to engage them. So we develop a stakeholder list. We identify a core group, as Daryl said. Not all the stakeholders may make the decision. It'll be reduced down to a core group of typically 5 to 10 people that will do the heavy lifting. But this communication protocols is very important, especially when you're dealing with these blockers. How do you keep them engaged? How do you keep them apprised of what you're talking about and how you're progressing through the decision process so that they have an opportunity to be heard? And that is a really fundamental piece as a facilitator, is understanding that people want to be heard. As long as they have been heard, their issues have been cataloged and slotted in an appropriate place that they agree to, a lot of the blocking disappears. And in some occasions, we have to develop a RACI matrix, responsible, accountable, support, consent, informed, to figure out who are the key players in that. And Cassandra, I think you had a couple of things.
Yeah, as Andy noted, I mean, obviously the RACI's brought up, so if possible, you know, engage your stakeholders early, you know, with clear communication, you know, on the requirements and timing for input, because as, you know, Andy said, they could block the decision if you don't, you know, have them feel that they've been heard. So you want to give them the opportunity, but also the timing for that, so that you can keep the process moving.
The decision statement speaks to the fundamental purpose. What are you trying to do? And when I do these things and I say, okay, we've allowed about 20 minutes to land on the decision statement. We have our 5 or 10 heavy lifting stakeholders in the room. We've allowed about a half an hour to decide on the decision statement. And the people look at you and say, well, that's pretty easy. I know what the decision is we're trying to make. And if you have 5 or 10 stakeholders in a room, you typically have 5 different decision statements. And it takes a little bit of time to ferret through that to determine the fundamental purpose of what you're trying to do. And the decision statement has to include action and object words. We also have to be careful about the right level we're working on. It can't be overly restrictive. So when you have the decision statement set properly, it really guides the process. But invariably, the decision statement will need to be rethought through. That it all made sense at the start of the decision process, but halfway through, as you've learned more about what you're trying to accomplish, there's value in revisiting it. In some cases, it needs to be modified. You will see this term consensus point pop up in a number of the slides, and that's very important because without consensus, there's no value moving forward. And so we often find the root of misunderstandings in making decisions is on the decision statement. And even though we may have 2 people saying the exact same words, they in fact have intended very different things. And as a facilitator, you need to figure that out. And you'll see as we go through the rest of the slides here that the other steps we do to achieve that clarity. Cassandra?
Yeah, so as Andy noted, I mean, certainly this may change, but having a clear decision statement, provides clarity for the team so that they understand what they're trying to achieve. And, most importantly, keeping it simple, but recognizing that it may change as you're moving through the process.
So if you're looking at it in the context of tailings and tailings facilities, a decision statement may be determine the best approach for managing tailings at the site. Now, again, it depends on the level of the decision you're working at. You may have sufficient information to reduce that decision down to one option, or you may be in early days where you're actually trying to use this process to create a short list. So on some projects, you will go through this process to shortlist the options, and then after additional information is gained and additional studies have been conducted, then you may revisit the decision analysis, revisit all the work that was done before in terms of objectives and cost metrics and so on, and then just update it in terms of to get to narrowing down to one preferred approach. You maybe already have the tailings technology figured out, and you saw Daryl's example of a 3,000 ton a day dry stack. Well, that's already been decided. So now you're trying to determine the best location for that dry stack. I hope you see here that these are two different levels. This is a higher level than this. The upper one is the best approach, which includes looking at dry stacking, slurry, filtered tails, thickened tails, and so on. That would all be part of those discussions. And you'll see the use of the term best. The term best is very important, and it means it's a combination of the technical merit, costs, and risks. So best is a very important term in this. We then look at the objectives, and we group them into musts and wants. The musts are absolute criteria, meeting a regulatory criteria, for example, factors of safety and so on, that need to be met. There may be policies, regulations, corporate requirements, and you then arrive at the outcome of the musts. Daryl, when we were preparing for this presentation, had an interesting story cautioning on musts. Daryl, did you want to share your thought there?
Yeah, I won't tell the whole story, only that in my experience, people can use musts to achieve the outcome they want. So one needs to be very careful in granting must power to different parties in the process. There's something that everyone will agree are musts, and there's other things where it can be one party trying to impose their outcome by narrowly defining the musts.
And that becomes a facilitation challenge. This slide shows some examples of typical musts if you're talking about a tailings management plan. The way we do it is we'll have a general broad element, what the objective is, what has to be met in terms of a must. And we provide these notes over here, and these notes are very important in terms of providing clarity of what is meant by these terms. And we'll often populate these notes column quite a bit with thoughts that people may have, because again, there may be misunderstandings of what these words mean. Then we get into those wants. These are objectives that allow an opportunity to differentiate between options, and minimizing cost is always an objective. We understand that, but we don't deal with it in the objective listing, which is different than what you see in the Environment Canada's MAA. Cost is embedded in Environment Canada's MAA as a socioeconomic objective. We think that is not appropriate, and you'll see how we find it very powerful to pull it out later. Cassandra will speak to that as well. Some examples of objectives may be minimize complexity, minimize water management and treatment, and so on. So here's some examples. We do use the MAA framework of technical operational elements, environmental elements, and socioeconomic or reputational elements. And we typically will have 10 or 20 elements under this banner, might be 8 or 10 or 20 under this banner, and this might be 5 to 10 under that banner. And again, we describe the fundamental element, and then we describe the objective. And what you see is the common use of the term maximize or minimize throughout. So if you go back to Daryl's example where he had that option of looking at the view shed, This is where you would handle that minimized change in viewshed. As Daryl said, you can't describe a cost to this. Therefore, it's an objective. You will see in this listing that none of these are directly related to cost. We often will see minimize haul distance, minimize pipeline distance. Well, that's just cost. That's another way of saying minimizing cost. We try to eliminate those objectives that are just different ways of saying minimize cost. Then there's a rating approach that we go through. Sorry, I'll come back to here. Okay, now come back. We go through a rating where each of the objectives are then rated. We define the bookends. We look at the best and the worst aspects of it. We say, okay, for a particular, let's take viewshed for example. Well, the best case would be that the option would have zero impact on the viewshed. The worst case may be that the option could look like heck and be like a big garbage dump sitting 20 meters away from our view. That's the two bookends, that's 0 and 10, and that's used to help inform the scoring. So we often will get to a consensus here as well. Now, when we do the weightings of these objectives, so we do the ratings, which is the bookends. If we look at 0 to 10, what's good and bad, and in between. Now we're getting into how important these objectives are to the different participants. And there's all kinds of different ways to do this weighting. But the important part is that I'm not really that hung up on whether it's a 7 or a 10 or a 5 or a 2. What's important is using this as a clarity for communication. So the way that I typically will do these, and Cassandra will talk about some different approaches, is that we will ask the different stakeholders to submit their weightings on a particular item, say this viewshed, for example. One stakeholder may say, yeah, that's like a 9 out of 10. That's really, really important to me. Another stakeholder may say, well, that's 3 out of 10. That's not so important to me. Neither stakeholder is wrong. Both have valid views. As a facilitator, it's then important to understand the basis for the 9 and the basis for the 3. And what comes out of that is clarity of communication, clarity of understanding. The person that had the 9 may have some very compelling points that the person that was thinking of the 3 had no idea. Sometimes the person with a 9 says, oh, I put in a 9 because I thought that's what everybody else would say. Oh, no, if you all think it's a 5, I'm a 5 too. But if the person with a 3 says, well, look, it doesn't really matter. There's transient, seasonal, recreational people living there. They don't really care about a viewshed. They're looking the other way. Who cares? But then all of a sudden you get into a clarity. So Cassandra, did you want to talk about some of the things you've seen when you do the weighting?
Yeah, so as Andy was talking, I mean, not everyone is necessarily comfortable, so they want to provide their input, but they may not want their weightings or ratings to be shared. So we've done a couple of different things because really what we want to do is allow people to be comfortable to provide their input. So several scenarios. One way we've used is using Excel, where that information is compiled by one individual so that the ratings and weightings aren't tied to an individual person, but then are discussed once we go through this. Another way to do it is using the Teams voting tool, again, to allow people to provide their opinions anonymously, really, because we just want their opinions and want them to feel comfortable doing it. And again, that then allows us to continue to ask questions to understand the numbers versus a specific person's opinion.
Great, thank you. This is an example of a weighting of some of the different objectives that have been described. And again, it's not that we're really hung up on these numbers as much as how you got there. We've talked several times about costs being treated separately. And so early in the process, we need to identify those metrics which are actually going to be important to informing the decision. Is it a capital cost, operating cost, or net present value? On some projects, we've seen cash flow as being the predominant metric. cash flow in the next 3 to 5 years. And this is one of those where you have a project which has a high capital investment up front, maybe some lower operating costs. Its NPV looks really attractive, but the cash flow is really not good for the company. And we need to have those discussions early on and understand that, because when we're developing the options, we need to be able to present the costs associated with those options in a manner that supports the decision making. And as we say, the cost metrics have a bearing on this whole decision, and it's another consensus point. Cassandra?
Yeah, I'll just note, when we work through this process, we do have the cost objective added at the end. So this allows, the team to go through all the options and then further refine it at the end.
So now we get into the alternatives. And earlier I described how we don't jump into the alternatives. Now, obviously the alternatives have been developed and people have given some thought to them. And as you're going through the process of the decision statement and the objectives, there will be a tendency for people to either modify the alternatives or to expand on them or to bring new ones to the table. And that's wonderful. We then bring them all together here. We use the term elements. Let's take a tailings management plan again as an example. Well, an element is thickened tailings. An element is site location A. Those are the elements. You could have thickened tailings going to site location A, then becomes the alternative. So we need to be clear when people are presenting their ideas of whether they're presenting a full alternative or whether they're presenting elements to be considered when building the alternatives. Now, we'll often get to a consensus point here as well in terms of the alternatives, because having a decision statement that clearly articulates what we're trying to accomplish, having the musts and wants clear, we can screen out a number of alternatives pretty quickly that end up not meeting the objectives very early on. Now, we talk about the weightings and the ratings that are intended to support the scoring. I would say 50% of the decision analyses I've done, we don't do the scoring any further. It stops, it boils down to straight costs, because we've gone through the objectives, we've gone through the understanding, everybody's on the same page of the playbook. The alternatives now are more robust in how they've been developed, and it reduces down to a cost discussion. Now, if the decision needs to be pushed onwards in terms of to corporate folks or investors or outside of your limited stakeholders, and the decision needs to be viewed as more defensible, well, the scoring continues. But it comes back to Daryl's earlier points about the different decision models and trying to not overcomplicate things if you don't have to. Cassandra?
Yeah, so just to add that, as Andy was noting, some can maybe be screened out. Some alternatives will be screened out initially quicker, but it's important that, all alternatives are considered, even if they may not be applicable or even doable, but the documentation of your alternatives review is critical for transparency. So if you're needing to share this information, as Andy noted, corporate ITRBs, others, you need to make sure that all of your alternatives were reviewed and documented appropriately.
So there's a scoring process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through that. That's not too difficult. Each alternative is then costed to determine their alternative cost. We may do high-level costs based on experience, or may do more detailed costs. Again, it depends on the decision statement and what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to narrow down a short list of options from like 8 or 10, high-level costing comparisons may be adequate. If you're trying to get it down to one decision, it may require advancing alternatives to pre-feasibility level design. But you're still keeping your eye on the metrics that were developed earlier: capital cost, operating cost, cash flow, and NPV. The risk assessment is a really important part of this, because there's often a desire to rush to the decision. Oh wow, I've got the best decision picked. It makes everything make sense. But this is a pause and reflection opportunity where you take the top alternatives, like the top 2 or 3 that really made a lot of sense, and then you go through a risk assessment and you tear the alternative apart and you ask the question, what could go wrong? What needs to be done to help keep the risks low? And you're actually trying to go through a process of normalizing the risks. If you can take those three options and go through the risk assessment, and for each of the three options, you can modify the alternative description such that you're able to get each option to a low risk profile, however you define low risks in your corporation. But if you can get each option down to a low risk profile, then that removes risk from the decision any longer. You're left now with costs and technical merit. But you may find that some of those risks cannot be removed. Regulatory risks is a typical example where you may have an alternative that looks really good, but there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how the regulators may view that project, and so it may not be a low risk. So you're able then to have a technical score coming from the alternative scoring, some sort of risk index, which ideally would all be low, and then a cost. And you're able to then do a balancing of how good the option is relative to the cost. Now, Kate Patterson in our group has worked a lot with Cassandra on different projects, and she has developed this slick little graphic, which I think really tells the tale. So the total cost is shown by these boxes here, these black outline boxes. The total cost is presented on the right-hand scale in terms of comparative cost estimate of millions of dollars. Now, obviously on the x-axis are different alternative for tailings facilities and so on, which we're not showing you here. We don't need to give you the idea what we're talking about. You see then the multiple account score here, and the green is environmental, the blue is technical, orange is social, and the dark orange or red is permitting and liability. What you can see here is that the highest scoring option is here at a low cost, whereas the highest cost option isn't even as good as this option. It also shows that going to this cost here didn't make a lot of sense. And you start to see, oh, okay, I'm achieving a balance now between my merit, the scores, and the costs, and these can help to inform the decision. Cassandra, do you want to add anything more on that?
No, I think you've covered it. I think that this graphic, as Andy notes, Kate provided that to us as well. And I think it really helps you clearly articulate your decision-making process to others.
Yeah, but you're right, because it shows the scores for each of the four components as well. This could be like the summary of the whole process, right?
Yes. Exactly.
So as Daryl outlined at the start, there's many different methods available for making a decision. For complex decisions with multiple competing objectives, multi-criteria decision analysis can be of value. What we've developed over the years is a modified version of Environment Canada's MAA. You don't see in our approach the use of the terms accounts and ledgers and subledgers. You can use that if you wish, that's fine, but we don't see the need to go there. And you see how we've taken a cost and moved them out of the objectives. So we've shared with you a few lessons. There's a couple of slides here that bring our lessons together. And experienced facilitators critical to success. Our challenge is we don't have a lot of experienced facilitators. So where we do have those, we need to start training and shadowing facilitators. I can't stress enough about identifying engaging key stakeholders, clear decision statements, cost separation. Depending on the circulation of the MCDA, this could affect the approach for establishing the weightings. Daryl, before I go to my last slide, can you speak to that a bit more, please? This is one of the value-added things you described in one of our previous meetings, the swing weighting concept.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Just trying to find the buttons. Yeah, one of the weaknesses about the MAA guidance, it doesn't really do a rigorous job of explaining how to do weightings and ratings. That's where looking into other systems can help a lot. Analytical hierarchy AHV is one method to do that. Swing weighting is another good method to do that. It allows a much more rigorous basis for all of those things, and in my opinion, makes a much more defensible analysis at the end.
Yeah. And this is the last slide, and then after I go through these 4 bullets, Cassandra, I'll turn it over to you. I can't stress how scoring is not the be all and end all. And folks get hung up on the scoring. Yes, it's important and it provides value, I get all that, but it is incredibly important for clarity. It's a catalyst for clarity more than anything else, because on some decision analysis, what we've done as a sensitivity analysis is we've taken all of the weightings, instead of having 3s, 5s, 7s, and 9s, made them all 5, and found at the end of the day, for some decisions, it didn't change the outcome. So that doesn't happen all the time, but it just illustrates a point that if you can't come to an agreement on a weighting, when this person advocating for 3 and another person advocating for 9, they may be steadfast in their opinions. They may truly believe they are right. That's totally fine. As a facilitator, you say, great, we're going to accept those 2 diametrically opposed opinions and move it on, and we'll come back and test them a little later. And through that, you start to realize that maybe that 3 and the 9 either didn't matter or they became critical to the decision and needed more examination. As Daryl was saying, this is a decision model. The numbers that come out of this are indicators. They're similar to the output of a geotechnical analysis to provide insights and clarity. The voting tools that Cassandra referred to earlier can be very useful. And again, depending on your delivery of this, this whole process can support documentation, transparency, and defensibility. So Cassandra, I'll let you have the last words and that'll close us off.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So yeah, just on the scoring, again, Andy noted that, and I think it's critical to really get the input of the stakeholders and, make sure that whatever tools you have available, you use them to get them to provide their information. And again, on the documentation, it's critical to make sure that you document your entire process, that it's transparent, it's defensible. As we all know, mining's cyclical. So this decision that you made today might go back on the shelf and you'll pick this up a couple of years later. So it's good to have the clear documentation so you can pick it up again.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's happened many times. So Alistair, that brings our presentation to a close at close to the top of the hour.
Thank you. Well done. That is a fascinating recap of the backbone or discipline of the whole process. And if you're like myself, we dived into Robertson's and Shaw's multiple accounts analysis, or it was thrust upon us without really understanding the wider systematic thinking aspects, which to me is a very valuable and strong reminder to have that discipline in mind. So thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. I'm not seeing anything in the question box. Has anybody in our team seen questions? I see a hand raised. Where are we?
Alistair, there are a couple questions in the questions panel here. Maybe I can ask the first one here is, what is the panel's advice when they encounter the statement from the project team, we need a decision workshop and we don't want too many people in the room because that will slow things down?
Who's going to take that one?
Daryl, do you want to take it first and I'll follow?
Yeah, I guess my response would be, you're right, it'll slow down the 1 day or day and a half of the decision process, but you'll get a lot of payback in time if you bring people along in that decision analysis. It's actually, in my experience, relatively easy to get to the right decision. It's much harder to get to the right decision and bring everybody with you. And the best chance to do that is to bring them to that decision analysis. As Andy pointed out, what you really get from the decision analysis is the insight. And to be there in real time and get the insight along with everybody else is very powerful, I think.
Yeah, and so Karen, I've had that same discussion many times, and I've told the client, no, we're not going to do it that way. Okay, we're not going to put 10 or 15 people in a room and do a workshop yet. What we need to do is have 4 or 5 preparatory conference calls or 3 or 4 preparatory calls before that, make sure all aligned, make sure we have the right people. Then we can spend time in a workshop setting. And if you don't have the right people engaged from the beginning, you're going to end up reworking the whole thing all over again. So many times it's been a trust us. We've done this before. I know what you want to do. What you want to do won't work. And you got to be clear on that as a facilitator. And you have to help them understand how to do it correctly, because otherwise it's a waste of everybody's time. Cassandra?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, you're really going back to identifying the stakeholders. So maybe you don't need 50 people in the room, but maybe it's 40 and those are the critical stakeholders. So doing that brainstorming, doing the initial checks to make sure you have everyone that you need on the team is really the most important. It's not the number.
I can't recall, Daryl, if you were involved in one I did. Daryl and I have worked together on a couple of these over the years, but we did one where we had 2 workshops. One workshop was, we did the preparatory work, all the run up to it. Then we finally had the face-to-face meeting with our core stakeholders, our core team of 6 or 10 people. And then we had another workshop where we invited all the other stakeholders that wished to be there, right? That wanted to be part of it, that wanted to be heard, and then had a presentation to them and got their inputs and so on. So there's different ways to manage these multiple stakeholder things. Daryl, do you have any other thoughts on that?
I think maybe we should just be aware that people might be hearing these answers and very different examples in mind. There are cases where if you get the right 3 people in the room, they can make a decision.
True.
And bring and have everybody needed. If you're talking about truly multi-stakeholder things, then it's a very significant investment of time to do it well. I've been involved in processes that took 2 years to prepare in terms of getting various communities involved. And the actual workshops themselves in those cases were 5-day workshops with 100 people in them representing different communities. So there are very different scales to these things, and it's absolutely legitimate. If you're getting that question, that's a very legitimate pushback. Are you giving me the question is very legitimate. Are you giving me the right scale here for the decision? That's a very legitimate question that you're getting there. So. I
had one decision analysis did about 10 years ago for a client that was looking at expanding their facility. And when I went in and I described the process, my client came up to me and he says, "You're doomed to fail. This will not work because we have a chief operating officer who is his way or the highway." And I said, "No, bear with me. There's ways to deal with this." So I ended up spending time at the site. I had one-on-one interviews with key staff and shared with them how I would capture their thoughts in the decision analysis process, including the COO, and was able to build a trust and a consensus before even going anywhere near the broader discussions. As a facilitator, that's what you have to do. You have to find different ways to manage the communication. There's all kinds of different things, and it can take time, because if you just drop out of the blue in a workshop, no.
Says to me that there's no point in moving forward with a decision if there's a potential that after you do a bunch of work, it could be blocked and not move forward at all. So
absolutely, and that's happened. We in fact had a project like that happen over the past 2 years, where the decision analysis wasn't done properly, and this decision got blocked, and a whole lot of rework.
Yeah. The second question here is, how have you handled or advised project teams when they say the facility must never fail when this is a probability and not an absolute controllable?
Daryl?
It's yeah. I guess that's the idea of avoiding musts and avoiding too many musts on the project. That typically we will try to use something like and code guidelines for acceptable levels of risk as a rating scale. And the best dams in the world have annualized likelihoods of failure of 1 in a million or something like that, 1 in 10 million, I suppose, not zero. So we would typically try to use scales like that, not just for that question, but for a lot of other questions. For example, you'll get people saying we must reduce water use, or we must do this, or we must do that. And a lot of times you can find a scale that allows people to express their interest in that topic without it being a must.
Yeah, I have nothing further to add to that, Karen. I agree with Daryl.
Okay, there's another one here. I've seen a lot of debate regarding what criteria to use as it's seen as a value statement as it is with weighting. Do you have a comment regarding how to manage that process?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so debate regarding what criteria to use as it's seen as a value statement as it is with weighting. So I think it's just
okay. If the criteria is turning into a value type of statement, that typically can morph into a want. If it's not hard and fast, because the must should not be value. I mean, sure, there could be, you need to meet company X's policies on health and safety. Sure, if that's a value statement, that's a value statement, that's a must. But if it's a conserve water management or preserve water use, well, that can be expressed as a want, unless you have a very specific criteria. Thou shalt not withdraw more than X thousands of liters a day from a river system, right? That's a criteria. So the must should not be, I don't believe must should be seen as value statements. Daryl, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wonder if the question is thinking about cases where people say they want a soil cover, for example, and
Right.
and that's do we have a soil cover is becomes an evaluation criteria. And in those cases, I find it's important to push back on the person who, and to get to the fundamental, what they really want. So people want something that lasts in perpetuity. They want something that the local wildlife can use, supports or whatever reclamation in all of those cases. And I try to put those into the criteria. Actually, I never use the word criteria either. I always use the word evaluation factors to avoid the hard and fast numerical things. So if you get to what you really care about is the question you need to be asking people when you're designing the decision scales. So I think you can usually get the concern that's being expressed in the question is correct. You can bias the system if you're not careful about the scales. The secret is to get down to what people really want. What fundamentally do they want? And avoid, and don't let them pick some intermediate step between what they want and the outcome. That's where the bias comes in.
Okay, so this one is, I guess, maybe less of a question, but maybe you guys have some comments to add to it. So at Tech, they've put a lot of emphasis on the framing process that leads up to decision analysis, and have found they can make a number of decisions without needing a quantitative decision.
Yeah, I've been involved in one opportunity framing workshop, and we just asked that the facilitator follow the same kind of process, but not getting into the scoring. And I think it's what I said earlier, they're very similar. You don't need the scoring as long as you understand what you're trying to accomplish and there's clarity in the objectives, then the alternatives can be put into the right framework.
Okay, and I think, oh, well, a couple more popping up, but have you compared the Environment Canada method and the one you presented? If so, are there any large differences in the outcome?
Oh, like run the same analysis both ways? I have not done that. I don't know if there'd be a large outcome in terms of how the costs are dealt with. There could be. I mean, if you take a look at that chart I showed at the end that had the very large cost thing, I could have really overwhelmed some of the MAA types of scoring. So no, I've not done a direct comparison, but nor would I ever attempt to, because I don't believe it's appropriate to build costs in as an objective, period.
Okay. In a conventional multi-criteria analysis, your criteria should be independent of each other in order to not double count certain factors. How do you approach establishing criteria that don't overlap but adequately capture all of the factors and getting agreement on these criteria?
Daryl?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's another one of the weaknesses of the MAA guidance. It doesn't sufficiently emphasize that. It doesn't really matter too much if what you're seeking is insight into the decision. But there are cases where people are going to use the numbers, and the numbers don't have to be absolutely correct, but they have to be defensible. If one's scoring 9 and the other is scoring 7, that should be a significant difference and a defensively significant difference. And so you do need to be careful about the math. And there's two elements of the math. One is you can't add things that aren't independent. You're double counting, as the questioner suggests. So again, it's a lot of thought that goes into how you choose your scales and how you choose your ratings and how you do the weightings. The general result of it is you end up with far fewer accounts or ledgers. I can't remember the MAA number, but far fewer of those than the Environment Canada guidance suggests is appropriate. But there's no way you can have up to 30 or 40 sub accounts and have them all independent.
So building on what Daryl's saying, in life, there are splitters and there are lumpers. I am a splitter in the early stage of a decision analysis process and a lumper in the latter stages. So what I do is that I would rather have 30 objectives under the technical and operational elements to start with. Again, I am trying to achieve clarity of understanding, clarity of communication. And if it takes 30 objectives to achieve that, I'll do 30 objectives. But at the end of the day, there's no way in heck 30 objectives are going to make any sense carrying forward into the decision analysis proper. Then we do the lumping. Then we start to say, okay, we've done the weighting of these, we've done some rating on them. At the end of the day, aren't objectives 6, 9, and 14 kind of variations on the same thing? Can we lump them together to try to capture, maybe make them a bit broader to pick up what we've been talking about? Yes. And you reduce the 30 down to like 7 or 8 that are meaningful. Because if you have too many, the thing just gets diluted. But I'm not saying you shouldn't have too many early on for clarity of understanding. Does that make sense, splitting and lumping?
Yeah, I would agree that this is where a good facilitator comes in to certainly help the participants work through that process, because everyone will want their objective on the list.
That's right.
And then as you work through the process, the team recognizes that, as you know, some can be lumped together, some maybe not as critical. You kind of work through the process, but having more at the beginning, I think, is the strength to then get to the clarity.
Yeah, maybe I could just, the way I've squared this circle in the past is I've said, tell me the 10 things you're interested in, and then it's the decision analyst has to build the actual scoring system. You can either do that as 10 things that are going to be independently weighted, or one thing that you know is independent of others, and you say, in scoring this environmental performance, for example, we want you to think about all these 10 things.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You to honor the inputs of all the different people, but not create a math that's not ultimately defensible. So that's one trick we've used when we have that problem. It's a very common problem. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think I'm going to just have this as the last question, seeing the time here, because it's a good one though. Have you had instances where decision was made, but at detailed design, the feeling is the wrong decision was made? Have you had to go back and readjust?
I've had it happen on one project only because the owner changed the goalposts in the detailed design stage. And that was so frustrating that as we're going through the detailed design stage, they changed how they wanted to view the water management and how they wanted to use that facility for its role in the overall water management scheme for the site, which fundamentally changed everything. But they didn't advise of that to us until we're in the detailed design stage. But if they had not changed that fundamental piece, my original decision at pre-fees would have held. So no, yeah, it could happen. There's no doubt it could happen. But I think it happens more to changes to the must-wants decision statement than it does to the process. If you do it right, you can have a garbage in, garbage out. There's no doubt about that. And if you do it wrong at the beginning and you have the wrong information in and you're too ambitious and limited information, you have the wrong stakeholders, you can have a stupid decision. There's no doubt about that. But if you do this right, that decision can hold quite well. Daryl?
The answer is yes, it's definitely happened to me, and I would argue in the cases I'm thinking of that they were good decisions at the time, but they were superseded by new information, and that's, you know, sometimes it's different people come involved in other reasons that aren't great, but often there's just new information or new perspectives that legitimately change the decision, Andy. So we can't have it perfectly all 3 times and come up with 3 different conclusions over the years. That can happen. There's nothing wrong with that. That's totally healthy, I think.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I just note that, you know, certainly again, because mining is cyclical and, you know, things change, you know, the decision that comes out of it, as Andy noted, it could be robust, but if suddenly your tonnages change or something in the mine plan changes, then, you know, you're going to have to go back and reassess. So it may just be something that's not in control at the time when the decision was made. But hopefully you don't get too far down to detailed design before that's recognized.
All right, thank you. Alistair, I don't know if you want to say a few words to close the session.
Yep, sure.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, panelists, for a really well-rounded set of insights. I've gained a lot, and I'm sure everybody else on the line has as well. And we will make the recording of this session available, and I'm sure that the panelists will entertain your questions. Any further questions you may have, we'll do our best to connect you if you want to pursue this. I will wrap up by reminding you that the CIM annual conference is going to happen here in just a few weeks in sunny Vancouver. Of the workshop that I mentioned earlier, that's dealing with guidance and the new standards that are being imposed on the industry, the challenges of giving that a fair hearing and achieving work-life balance, and above all, building and operating safe facilities. One final comment, today's session has reminded me that what I did a few years ago was dig up that old movie 12 Angry Men with Henry Fonda in a New York summer humid courtroom, and it calls to mind the challenges somehow that you're faced in building consensus, but at least you've shown us a very solid, disciplined set of approaches to making the best of it and making the tailings world a better place. So thank you very much to the panelists and all of you who have attended. See you in Vancouver. Ciao. Thank you, guys. Really very well done.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair.
Yeah.